Convergence. Points of contact between the Garden Creek/Mount Pisgah provenance problem and the Monk's Mound 2007 stabilization record. A synthesis, version 1.0, Barrows Research, July 2026. Two investigations, separated by 700 miles and 124 years of institutional history. The first is a provenance investigation into roughly 600 karstite and clay objects collected in Haywood County, North Carolina, between 1879 and 1884. The second is a documentary analysis of a slope stabilization project executed on the largest earthen monument in North America in August of 2007. They were built independently, on different evidence, for different purposes. They converge on 22 points. And on one of them they converge literally, on the same site. Part 1. The shared object of study. Point 1. The ceremonial architecture sequence. Garden Creek Mound No. 1, Site 31HW1, Haywood County, North Carolina, Pisgah phase, about AD 1000 to 1250. Two side-by-side square earth lodges lie beneath the platform mound. Earth Lodge 1 is approximately 24 feet square, its floor cut about 2.2 feet below the old ground surface. Earth Lodge 2 is approximately 28 feet square, cut about 1.2 feet down. The two are connected, and the larger could be entered only through this smaller, a graded access arrangement rather than two equivalent rooms. Decommissioning proceeded through a boulder mantle, a midden mantle, clay caps, and collapse episodes, after which platform stages carried summit structures. At Monk's Mound, Feature 1 is an upright ball cypress and limestone structure encountered within the mound at 143.7 meters. Timothy Pocketat was present when it was exposed on August 8, 2007, and rated as a charnel house. Nelson Reed independently connected an east slope limestone pavement with posts to the regional charnel house class. And the House of Mystery reading is not an outside import. Timothy Schilling argues it for Monk's Mound directly, at pages 42 to 47 and 307 to 309 of his Washington University dissertation on the construction of the mound itself. The comparative field around it is wide and documented. Musco G Square Ground Organization, with its four-building courtyard, central fire, clan and moiety seating and annual renewal cycle. The intra-mound chambers at Soto, Older Mound 10, where a burned building lies beneath a mound, and the successive summit structures at Monk's Mound itself. And two barriers are gone. Richard Yerkes rejects the proposed clean functional split between the Ohio Valley and the Southeast, Edina, Hopewell and Middle Mississippi mounds and their associated structures had many forms and functions. He also rejects a universal mound over structure sequence. That second rejection matters for this comparison in particular, because it removes the objection that Feature 1 sits inside the mound rather than beneath it. Moundville Mound 5 demonstrates that paired or conjoined architecture can occur on a summit, and that variation argues against any rigid positional sequence. What remains open is function, and function is open for a testing reason, not an interpretive one. Excavation or detailed geophysical remote sensing would close it. This comparison is foundational, central to preservation, to testing, and to consultation. Two documents would move it. The flag map would let the H.9 overlay, which predicts paired square geometry in the northeast quarter, be tested against measured stratigraphy. And Keel 1976 and Dickens 1976, read at page level, would replace the second-hand carriage of the twin lodge dimensions with the primary measurements. Point 2. In both investigations, the artifact under examination is the paperwork. On the Garden Creek side, the Osborne-Valentine correspondence had 188 entries, the London Album Ledger, a 156-row provenience index, the 1883 Treasury disbursing vouchers, accession 13191, the University of North Carolina RLA catalog, and the Smithsonian's own ledger classification. On the Monk's Mound side, a single Illinois Freedom of Information request, a 1,447-page consolidated master record, of which 463 pages are assigned to the 2007 work and 984 to separate projects, the July 10 concurrence, the January 26, 2010 clearance, and 3 formal response letters. In both cases the physical site is comparatively secure. What is contested is the record made about it. Point 3. Both refuse the blanket verdict. The Garden Creek thesis states it as a controlling finding. No surviving objection justifies treating the corpus as a blanket fraud. The controlling model is a mixed corpus, ancient objects, historic period native objects, period copies, paid comparison specimens, repaired and stained pieces, mislabeled objects. Point 4. 1. Grading architecture. 2. Applications. Garden Creek runs proven, strong, supported, unresolved, contradicted, applied at 4 distinct claim levels: site, corpus, class, and object. That stratification is what makes the mixed corpus model workable. It permits the sentence, Garden Creek is an authentic native archaeological, ceremonial, and mortuary landscape, proven, at the site level, independent of any carving dispute, while every individual carving remains open. Monk's Mound runs proven, strong, supported, unresolved, unsupported hypothesis. And it states the rule explicitly: the grades are not rhetorical labels. Each grade requires a stated basis and an identified falsifier. In both files, a grade is not an adjective. It is a decision rule carrying, in advance, the named condition that would overturn it. Point 5. Importance is separated from proof. This is the move that keeps both projects honest, and both had to build vocabulary for it. Monk's Mound states it directly: foundational is an importance designation rather than a substitute for proven. Feature 1 is foundational as a charnel house hypothesis. Feature 50A is foundational as a burial context. Neither is thereby demonstrated. Garden Creek does the same thing under a different name. The reported clinker or slag at the figurine locus in Mound 1 is entered as reported high priority contacts evidence pending verification, precisely because no exact catalog row, field note page, photograph, bag label, or laboratory identification has yet been produced for it, while the thesis states plainly that its evidentiary importance is nonetheless high. The Dudum and clan symbol alignment is held the same way: exploratory, not yet evidential. Both files needed a category for a finding that is central and unproven at the same time, and refused to let centrality quietly become proof. Part 2. The discipline of silence. Point 6. A shared negative evidence standard. Monk's Mound writes the rule out in full. Absence from a freedom of information production can show that a document was not produced. It cannot, by itself, prove that the document never existed, or that an undocumented telephone call or field direction never occurred. Strong negative evidence requires a targeted no records response, an affirmative representation that the production is complete for that category, or an institutional rule showing the act would necessarily have generated a retained record. And then the crucial sentence: this standard cuts both ways. The report does not infer that no revised approval occurred merely because none appears. It states that renewed approval is not demonstrated. Garden Creek applies the identical discipline to an 1883 question. The Code of Indian Offenses is proven at the policy level as the suppression climate surrounding the episode. But a direct court order to the Smithsonian has not been located, and the thesis carries that as a verified negative to date, not as proof that the policy pressure was absent, and not as proof that such an order never existed. In both files, silence becomes a retrieval target rather than an argument. Point 7. Both records are missing the same mill. The Monk's Mound report states the gap in one sentence. The review and closeout papers were produced. The missing middle is the authenticated plan set, the field directions, the quantities, the monitoring and feature logs, the stop work and restart entries, the borrow clearance, the native or as-built survey files, the curation documentation, and any post-2007 verification. The 7 drawing sheets, G1 through G7, are named in a schedule and referenced in agency comments, but not one sheet has been released. Garden Creek has the same shape at 1883 scale. 3 spring letters from Emmert, 1 of May 3rd and 2 of May 11th, are missing in full text, and a control card of 1886 documents their rerouting. That has graded a documented gap, with a retrieval target named. Both corpora are strong on what was proposed and strong on how it was closed out, and close to silent exactly where the decisions were made. Point 8. Custody is traced by name and bounded by a name. Garden Creek names its holders individually: Oxford Authentication for the thermoluminescence chain, the Valentine Museum for the accession and its catalog, the National Archives, Record Group 217, account number 237177, for the dispersing vouchers, the Southern Historical Collection, collection 2837, for the correspondence originals, the RLA for the catalog, and the Eastern Band Tribal Historic Preservation Office for consultation. Each is named as the holder of a specific outstanding record, not as a general institutional reference. Monk's Mound does the same with a live Freedom of Information chain. The Department of Natural Resources states that it found no additional records for 6 categories and identifies the Capital Development Board as a possible custodian for 2 more. And then the report bounds its own finding. That response proves the department's stated search result and present custody position. It does not prove that a record never existed or that it is absent from the Capital Development Board, the Illinois State Museum. Point 9. Expert correspondence is treated as evidence with its own stated limits. The Monk's Mound report registers for expert replies as numbered appendices, Pocketat, Emerson, Yerkes, and Clausen, and then does something unusual. It lets one of them lower its own gray. Richard Yerkes's reply supplies the controlling limit on feature 1. Without excavation or detailed geophysical remote sensing, the precise function cannot be determined, and the charnel house interpretation is plausible but has not been demonstrated. Earlier exact match language is withdrawn on that basis. Thomas Emerson's account is registered as expert process criticism, explicitly not as evidence of motive. And Cheryl Clausen's own correction of archaic versus archaic is adopted as a report-wide editorial control. Garden Creek runs the same register with Oxford Authentication, the Valentine Museum, the National Archives, and the Eastern Band. And it applies the same weighing to a primary-era witness. Merritt Burnett's denial that he made or claimed to make the carvings is relayed secondhand. Burnett to Osborne to Valentine is unsworn and arrives through the collector's own correspondence, an interested party. The thesis states each of those limits and then uses the letter anyway for exactly what it can carry. In both, an expert answer is an interpretation with a stated basis. It is never an adjudication. Point 10. The compiler corrects himself in public and keeps the old text visible. The Monk's Mound report is built on a supersession ledger. Memorandum RC3, version 1.3, supersedes version 1.0 and withdraws the claim that the two feature 50A outcomes were independent. Version 6.94 withdraws exact match, universal succession, and one institution formulations after the Yerkes reply. The earlier 1500 cubic meter estimate is retained only in the supersession ledger. Nothing is quietly deleted. Garden Creek does the same to one of its own strongest anchors. The Bushyhead letter of December 15, 1880 is verified as a document, but the speaker is revised. Not Principal Chief Dennis W. Bushyhead, as originally carried by Macon County Cherokee man, Bestfit George Bushyhead of Sandtown, with the identity left open and the writer's own misunderstanding caveat preserved. In both files the correction is not an embarrassment to be minimized. It is part of the evidence. Part 3. The Laboratory Problem. Point 11. 2 assay programs, 1 failure mode. In 2025, 8 objects from the Garden Creek corpus were sampled for thermoluminescence. 2 returned last firing events within roughly the last century on the sampled zones. 6 were too insensitive to yield a date at all, attributed to talc-derived mineralogy unsuitable for thermoluminescence dosimetry. At Monk's Mound, bone from the feature 50 a dog burial returned a late archaic or early woodland outcome, then a middle woodland outcome, and a separate portion failed for insufficient carbon. The report retains both outcomes in full and grades their direct chronological weight unresolved, because no numerical ages, no errors, no laboratory identifiers, no stable isotope values, no pretreatment data, no collagen yields, and no calibrated ranges were ever published. In neither case is the result the problem. In both cases the problem is that the underlying laboratory record cannot be audited. And both files draw the same conclusion from that. This prevents either side from claiming more than the record can carry. Point 12. A rerun is not a replication and a sample zone is not a corpus. This is the same category error caught in 2 different laboratories. Version 7.10 of the Monk's Mound report corrects a claim the compiler had previously made himself. The second completed feature 50 ASA was a rerun of the same sample, not a second independent sample. 2 outcomes had been read as mutual corroboration. They were one measurement twice. Both outcomes are preserved, the independence claim is withdrawn. The Garden Creek thesis states its boundary before anyone can make the equivalent mistake. Thermoluminescence tests the sampled fire clay context and the last heating or firing event. It is not a test of maker identity, of excavation context, of legal status, or of the corpus as a whole. 2 adverse results are a serious adverse datum for 2 sampled zones on 2 objects, and they are not a verdict on 600. In both files, the discipline is the same. Do not mistake what was measured for what is being claimed. Point 13. Legacy radiocarbon dates the context, not the contested thing. Garden Creek carries 4 geochron determinations, GX 595, 596, 729, and 730, submitted by Coe and published by Keel and Dickens in 1976. The thesis states the caution plainly: they date charcoal and cite features and components, not the carved objects. And the accompanying AMS series is listed in the radiocarbon database with no context and no significance shown at all, which is entered as a verification item rather than used. Monk's Mound reaches the same finding about its own foundation dates. I-2308 lies in stage C, above undated stages A and B, and may be residual. M1636 is the only determination tied to a central mass. Point 14. Both audit a widely circulating number back to its source, and both find it will not bear the weight placed on it. Emmert's April 11, 1883 letter relays an informant's figure that Valentine's agent has paid out over $2,000 in the last 3 years for relics. That number has been quoted ever since. The thesis sets it against the documented remittance subset actually visible in the record, roughly $215 to $220, and grades the pair as hearsay against a documented lower bound, with the payment audit named as outstanding. Monk's Mound audits its own received range the same way. The AD 900 to 1150 figure is not a construction date. Its start is carried backward from a determination that sits above undated stages. Its terminal figure is the mean of 2 minimum ages, one of which belongs to a later terrace entirely. That is negative evidence against an overly narrow received range, not a positive early date. And the earlier 1500 cubic meter removal estimate is superseded outright by a bounded model of roughly 2000 to 2700 cubic meters, best single estimate near 2400. A figure in wide circulation is not a measurement. In both files it gets traced back to whatever produced it. Part 4. Iron, heat, and the category error. Point 15. Iron selects the sample, phase reports the results. At Garden Creek the question is Emmert's water aging claim, that ferruginous water produced the aged appearance of the objects. The thesis answers on mineralogy. Ferruginous water can stain surfaces, but it cannot produce through body thermal phases, coherent tau-tungstatite alteration, vitrified or cindered fabric, or analytically confirmed clinker or slag at the same locus. Iron staining and a genuine high-temperature phase change are different physical events that happen to share a color. The catalog audit sharpens rather than overturns that. Across 17,715 records there is one clinker at Garden Creek Mound 1, cataloged under slag and slag, while the only other clinker record in the same county is cataloged coal. The cataloger had coal available as a determination and did not use it here. And that clinker sits at the center of the densest ash concentration in accession 2115. 5 of the site's 11 ash records fall within 31 catalog numbers, flanking it on both sides. That is a strong case for testing priority. It is not yet a temperature. At Monk's Mound the same trap appears as limonite. Iron pan banding can arise after construction through redox movement and cementation, with no human intention at any point. The closest proven intersection is the Danish turf barrow, where turf construction generated an iron shell emergently, a formation mechanism, not a technology. And the report states the rule in 5 words: color alone is not evidence of heating. In both files, iron is what selects the sample. It is never what reports the result. Point 16. Neither file will call a mineral body intentional without phase chemistry. Garden Creek sets the bar for its own most promising lead. True clinker or slag may be claimed only if phase and chemistry confirm it, not simply because a lump looks burned. Required: independent X-ray diffraction, scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive spectroscopy, Raman, Fourier transform infrared, petrographic, or comparable confirmation. That standard is applied to the thesis's own best evidence before anyone else can apply it. Monk's Mound sets the identical bar. A mineral body should be called intentional only after micromorphology shows and placement, and only after mineralogical and provenance work distinguishes it from an in situ redox pan. The conversion of yellow goethite to red hematite by heating is chemically established and historically used in pigment production, and the report finds no demonstration of it in an Eastern North American mound fabric, so it is retained as an unstudied test requiring X-ray diffraction or Raman identification, magnetic susceptibility, and contextual heat alteration. The same instrument list, arrived at independently, guarding the same inference. Point 17. Both files build a tiered scale for the express purpose of preventing a category error. The Garden Creek thermal tier reads: low-fired earthenware, commonly about 500 to 800 degrees Celsius, calcine bone, with structural change around 645 degrees and above, talc converting toward instathite, beginning near 800 degrees and peaking near 895, vitrification or sintering, roughly 900 to 1100 degrees and above, and true clinker or slag, often between 1250 and 1450. The corrected wording is explicit. Instathite indicates significant high heat. True clinker and slag require separate confirmation and usually a hotter system. The thesis wrote this tier to correct its own earlier temperature language. The Monk's Mound earthen technology control does the same work on a different axis. 3 practices must not be collapsed: saw block construction, which is proven; deliberate selection of colored and texturally distinct clays, which is strong. Part 5. Structure, contact, and obligation. Point 18. The contested feature at both sites is the same class of thing and receives the same grade shape. At Monk's Mound, feature 1 is an upright ball cypress and limestone structure encountered within the mound. Its existence is proven. On August 8, 2007, Timothy Pocketat was present when it was exposed and rated as a charnel house. Mark Essary read the same feature as a small building foundation or the end of a log-roofed building. The physical finding and the interpretive limit are held apart. Precise function, complete plan, contents, and use episode remain unresolved. At Garden Creek, stone and charcoal mortuary construction at the Pigeon River Mounds is corroborated across 3 separate record layers: Osborne in 1880, Hay in 1915 and 1919, and Coe and Wright at Mound 1. And the thesis grades it precisely: convergence documented at the term level, single feature identity open. 3 sources describing stone and charcoal construction is not the same as 3 sources describing one feature. The grade shape is identical in both files. A feature is real. The label is not proven. And the distance between those 2 statements is stated rather than close. Point 19. A European trade bell sits in the contact period layer of both monuments. At Garden Creek, the termination GX729, charcoal from Mound 1, square 215 R145, Zone A, at 205 plus or minus 65 years before present, is recorded with qualla pottery and a cast bronze bell. That is a contact era horizon sitting on a mound whose ceremonial sequence begins far earlier, in the middle woodland, at GX730. At Monk's Mound, the River Elab mission monograph documents a French chapel and Cahokia Illini settlement on the first terrace between 1735 and 1752, with an associated cemetery, an oval indigenous dwelling, domestic pits, 6,573 glass beads, and a brass bell bearing 4 fleur-de-lis. And both files apply exactly the same control to their own find. The post-contact layer is significant. It establishes an institutional knowledge baseline, and it does not prove overlap with the disputed zone. At Cahokia, the first terrace data do not demonstrate overlap with the 2007 northwest or east slope cuts. At Garden Creek, the contact horizon does not resolve the object level question. Neither file lets a genuine, well-dated find quietly answer a different question than the one it addresses. Point 20. Mortuary obligation precedes the finding. Garden Creek is a mortuary landscape, and the Valentine-era collection includes funerary objects inventoried under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The thesis makes a point that is easy to miss. The chain of custody itself runs through Eastern Band leadership, because the 1883 expedition's mound work and elder consultation were hosted on the Qualla boundary by Principal Chief Nimrod J. The Eastern Band is therefore a documented party to the custody history, not merely an interested descendant community. Every recommendation in the thesis operates inside the consultation framework, and speculative ceremonial readings are not to be presented as settled fact. At Monk's Mound, the same obligation appears as its absence. An internal agency memorandum in the released record states that separate public land archaeology and burial law permits were not needed. The report's finding is exact. The Human Skeletal Remains Protection Act was not merely unaddressed but affirmatively set aside. And for the limestone and post feature, no release documents a complete examination of the fill, screening of the immediate locality, a human remains determination, or any notification and treatment chain. In both files, the failure to perform the mortuary assessment is a governance finding in its own right, independent of and prior to whatever the archaeology turns out to show. Point 21. Morphology does not report function, and the same scholar said so twice 43 years apart. In 1983, Richard Yerkes opened his microware results with a correction: contrary to Meltzer's assertion, tool morphology does not necessarily reflect tool function. Objects that a morphological classification had called chisels, gravers, and scraping tools turned out, under the microscope, to be shell drills. 86% had been used as drills, 91% of those carried shell polish. Form said one thing. Use said another. 43 years later, the same Richard Yerkes writes into the Monk's Mound file about Feature 1 and says that its precise function cannot be determined without excavation or detailed geophysical remote sensing, and that the charnel house reading is plausible but not demonstrated. Same principle, different artifact class, same scholar, and it is the reply that lowered the compiler's own grade. Cheryl Clausen supplied the third instance independently. Skeletal measurements cannot determine the era of a burial. Morphology does not report chronology. And Garden Creek reaches the fourth on its own. The corpus spans multiple apparent hands, a wide material range, and different firing signatures and clay fabrics, and the thesis states plainly that this heterogeneity is neutral on authenticity. It fits poorly with one forger's batch and equally. Point 22. Two-term audits, two negatives, and the same refusal to overrate them. In version 6.33, the Monk's Mound report answers a question about burnt clay in the mound fill by stating the negative first. No unit in any of the four 2005 cores is described as burnt, burned, fired, or reddened. Those four terms return no occurrences across the whole of Appendix A. There is no burned clay category in the Figure 3 legend. And then the report declines to stop there. The answer, it says, is narrower than the question assumes. There is one piece of daub, and daub is burned clay by definition, surviving only because it was fired, ordinarily when the structure carrying it burned. There is a possible baked surface logged at 5.95 meters in core MMD1, registered as a possible thermally altered interface. And there is WIS 587, a burned thatch layer with interspersed ash layers on the east slumps, dated to 1150 plus or minus 60 years before present, which the report calls a genuine burned surface in the dated record at Monk's Mound. 11 months later, the Garden Creek catalog audit runs the identical instrument across 17,715 records and returns the identical shape of answer. 0 and statite. 0 cristobalite. 0 kiln, furnace, vitrified, overfired, waster, tire, crucible. And against that negative, 3,332 heat-proxy records, 2,706 of them at Garden Creek Mound 1, 34,614 parsed units, and 1,339 daub records. The verdict, extensive heating and burning, not a proven kiln. Neither audit was written with the other in view. Both stated the negative before the proxies. Neither allowed a word search to answer a material question. And the asymmetry between them is itself useful. Monk's Mound shows what a mound with almost no burned architecture looks like in a core log, which makes it a genuine negative control for the daub mass at Garden Creek. Point 23. Cyrus Thomas is the hinge. In the 1880s, the live argument in American archaeology was whether the mounds had been raised by a vanished race or by the ancestors of historic native nations. Baldwin, Short, Conant, MacLean, Carr, Foster, Squeer, and Davis, and above all Brinton and Cyrus Thomas constitute that argument, and the Garden Creek thesis names Thomas as its hinge. At Cahokia, the doubt was concrete. Monk's Mound had to be argued into existence as a human work. David Bushnell's 1914 account rejected the idea that the mound was a natural alluvial remnant, and did so by pointing to artificial stratification, basket-sized deposits, cardinal orientation, and the relationship between the central mound and the complex around it. The question that had to be answered at the largest earthen monument in North America was whether native people had built it at all. The program that answered that question, across the Mississippi Valley, was the Bureau of Ethnology Mound Survey under Cyrus Thomas. That same survey employed J. W. Emmer, and that same survey's 1894 report moved the Garden Creek objects from ethnologic specimens, as Thomas had called them in 1883, to bogus articles. One survey, one director, 11 years. Native authorship of the mounds vindicated at one end, and a native attributed object class written off as fraudulent at the other. The policy climate around that second verdict is proven. The 1883 Code of Indian Offenses established courts of Indian offenses suppressing dances, medicine practices, and related ceremonial conduct, and the thesis states the consequence exactly. The object class at issue is by its period attribution, medicine practice material of exactly the category federal policy targeted. No direct court or interior order to the Smithsonian or to Emmer concerning these objects has been located. The framing is therefore environmental rather than conspiratorial, and a simulation-era climate hostile to medicine practice, inside which institutional skepticism hardened into received dismissal. The shared controlling finding. Neither of these files is an accusation. Both are instruments for holding a question open under sustained pressure to close it. Garden Creek returns no blanket verdict. The corpus is resolved object, by catalog number, by custody branch, by condition mapping, and by material testing. Not all real. Not all fraudulent. Monk's Mound returns in complete documentary conformity. Authorization and substantial archaeology both existed. The released record does not fully connect reviewed plans, field enlargement, discovery-specific decisions, monitoring continuity, and administrative closeout. That is not a finding of historical non-existence, and it is not an adjudication of lawfulness. The convergence between them is not coincidence. It is what happens when one evidentiary discipline is applied to two institutional records that were each built, in part, to settle a question early. In both cases, the site was never really in doubt. What was in doubt was the record, and in both cases the record turned out to be the thing that needed excavating. Convergence. A synthesis of two Barrows Research Productions, reassessing the Garden Creek